We start with this. Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga says the COVID-19 pandemic seriously affected literacy levels of learners in South Africa. She's been updating the media on developments in the sector. This after Motshekga came under fire following a study which found that over 80% of grade 4 pupils could not read for meaning. So in May, the Education Department released the results of the 2021 Progress in International Reading Literacy study. It showed only 19% of those grade 4 pupils could read for meaning in any language. That was down 3%. And remember, we were already scoring very poorly in the previous assessment years before that. To discuss, we're now joined by Director of National Assessment at the Department of Education, Dr. Mark Chetty. Dr. Chetty, thank you for being with us. The Minister has said this before, that so much time was lost during COVID-19 and many countries saw the decline. COVID-19, though, is that not a convenient excuse for South Africa when we've seen those literacy results coming in very poorly for a long time?
Good evening, Francis, and good evening to your viewers. Yes, it's one of the factors. We're not saying it's the only factor, but it's a significant factor. Because in 2020, we lost about 56% of teaching time. In 2021, almost a quarter. Now, the students that took the test in the Pearls took it in 2021. So they were taking the test amidst quite a high disruption of schooling and loss of teaching time. This doesn't underpin, like you were saying, some of the learning losses that were witnessed or observed prior to the pandemic. But our international studies, and we don't only participate in Pearls, we participate in TIMS, which is maths and science, SACMEG, which is a regional study. We're all showing that we were improving as a system until the pandemic hit in 2020.
So what do you expect in coming years? Are you hoping that improvement will come back in?
Well, we are hopeful and we are expecting that. That's the trajectory of the system. What we're seeing is that we're complementing our Pearls data with local national assessments, quite robust assessments to give us a more complete picture. So we have the annual, the ELNA, the Early Learning National Assessment, and we have the National Systemic Evaluation. Now, both these are locally set and locally designed assessments. So what they show, Francis, is that there is a lot more building blocks and growth points in those studies. Pearls is an international assessment. So its curriculum there isn't a direct match for our curriculum to those tests. But it is stretching our learners.
But it measures reading, right? Reading in any language. We can't say there's a language barrier.
Sure.
Reading is universal.
Yeah. So what we're seeing in the local assessments, you're seeing in systemic evaluation a score of about 438 at the grade 3 level. This is similar to a Pearls design. So it's testing foundational reading comprehension. Yeah. So the 400 points on an international scale is more or less an acceptable benchmark. Still improvement needed, but it's more at an acceptable level compared to Pearls, which we're seeing scores is 288.
Well, it sounds pathetic. 80% of students can't read for meaning. Even if we get a little bit better, many would say this is a crisis. What is the department doing to respond to a reading crisis? And we have a similar crisis with numeracy.
And I think, Francis, we've got to get the languaging right. And hence we had a media briefing this morning. So this is not about learners learning to read. This is about reading comprehension, which is a higher skill. What we show in our early learning national assessment is that you've got interrelated skills. You've got listening and speaking, you've got phonemic awareness, you've got writing, and you've got reading. Now, all that is showing us that our learners at a grade 1 level is about 64% mean. So you've got a growth point there. Systemic evaluation, as I've indicated, it's above 400 points. So in terms of the Pearls framework, where you're looking at a cognitive demand that's much higher than, the South African average learner is exposed to in the curriculum, it is stretching the South African learners. And what we're seeing in that, mainly in the African languages, this becomes, more exacerbated in terms of low socioeconomic status in certain African language groupings.
And teaching is huge as well. You need to make sure that the teachers can pass the test. At one point there was concern about teachers not being able to pass the maths test that they were preparing the kids for. How are you gauging teaching standards? How are you improving teaching standards?
It's interesting that, and in our plan going forward, a skilled teacher is a critical pillar because the teachers are at the nexus of mediating knowledge. But Francis, what we're also seeing from the linguistic experts is that even the teaching of reading in African languages, for many years have been benchmarked against teaching of English, using English as a norm towards skilling teachers in teaching the African languages. So we're looking at the phonemic awareness, we're looking at they call it the morphologies, the language structures. So a lot of that has been based on English norms. So what we see going forward now is a greater emphasis, a greater awareness of the science of reading in African languages. So yes, it's about skilling teachers, but it's about skilling teachers in the teaching and the learning of reading in African languages, which should not be based on just English norms.
I see the minister has been talking about the fact that adults don't read in this country either, so there's a gap there. And then the focus on early development. I remember the tragedy that many early development centres, ECD centres, could not open after COVID-19. Well, they didn't have the sanitation, they didn't have the equipment. Never mind the fact that mothers need to go to work and they just need a safe place to drop their young children. That seemed to go on for a really protracted period. Is there a space for basic education to work well with those early development centres and catch kids really young? What are we doing?
And as you might be aware, we've now, as a Department of Basic Education, been absorbed, have absorbed the ECD centres. So now we are responsible even from 0 to 4 years old. So that's going to give us a little bit more control in terms of how do we sort of register ECD centres, how do we get them more sort of online and, getting them back on track quicker from a disrupted start, should there be any disruptions, going forward. And we're seeing that even reading skills, the earlier you start, like you're saying, the love for reading, parents reading with their children starts at a very early age, mothers speaking to their babies. And that sort of transfers into stronger language skills. It's interesting that you speak about a reading culture, and Minister has said that as well. Across all age groups, South Africans, we're not really a reading country. The reading culture, even amongst adults, and adults engaging their children, it seems to be more constrained than in other countries that are doing well on pearls, like Russia and Singapore. So we need to inculcate this from an early age, from the ECD through schooling, through to adults, this love for reading, this culture of reading, so that, it does filter through our learners throughout the different age groups.
All right, read to your kids. Well, thank you for that update. That was the Department of Education Director of National Assessment, Dr. Mark Chetty.